Okay. We're starting a new book. Done with Mark. Unfortunately, we're moving from some scholars, I kind of disagree with them, but some scholars say Mark is the simplest, easiest Greek in the New Testament. I think we saw that it was a very complex and well-written book, although it may be the simplest Greek, because Hebrew is the exact opposite. Hebrew is probably the most complex Greek document in the New Testament. And we will find it out very quickly. The problem with that is, what does that probably mean for our translations? And that's the thing.
All over the place.
That is exactly right. They are all over the place, and we will see it ourselves. But I'll just, and most of you have been in this class before, but I'll remind you what we do in this class. The most important thing, the question that I want to answer for myself, all right, and I expect you do too. You can raise your hands if you want, but this is my life. I want to know, what do the documents say? I don't really care what they say in an English sense either. I want to know what they said or they meant in the time period in which they were written. I don't want all this gloss, okay? I will talk about theology or doctrine if it's historical theology or doctrine, but I do not I don't want to remain there. I'll answer any question that I can about theology and doctrine within the context. But the most important thing to me is, what does the Greek actually say? Because it is Greek. Hebrew is a Greek document. And not what does it mean for today. That's your homework. You can figure out what it means theologically, doctrinally, and what it means for you. I don't think that's pertinent. As a matter of fact, if it means something different for you than it does for me, we have a serious problem, I think. So what I would like to know is, what does it mean, and especially within the context of the history. So what does the documents mean historically? And of course, that all resolves to the words. You know, I have great examples. I probably should bring my favorite examples like epithumia. You know, and we'll talk about all these details. We have to, because half of Hebrews is about the sacrificial system. So we've got to get into the sacrificial system. But epithumia in Greek means the scent of the sacrifice. However, epithumia, if you all remember, is one of the love words, usually translated desire or lust. But epithumia means literally the smell of the sacrifice. Well, why would that give you desire or lust? Because if you were Hebrew, you ate meat 6 times a year. If you were Greek, you usually ate meat 12 times a year during the festivals. All meat in the ancient world was sacrificed to idols. And that's part of the things. If we want to understand Hebrews, we can't go at Hebrews or any other New Testament document with our worldview. Our worldview will not work. If we look at the world of the ancient times, in our worldview, we will never ever understand what the Greek is trying to tell us. We won't, and if you want, from a theological standpoint, put your toe in the theological pool. How can you understand what God wants to tell you? That is, okay, and we're making a, we're making a broad, because we haven't got to that point yet, that's the second class. What is the veracity of the text? That is, what is the historical value, the veracity? But if you take the standpoint of the church, which I will not argue is not a good point, which is that this is theos pneuma, that is God-breathed. Okay, if you take that position, then if you don't understand what the documents say from a concrete and historical standpoint, then you have no idea what's going on. What is God telling you? And that's theological, right? That's the place we don't want to go, but we'd like to understand it. And from, that's what I'm saying. From when I was a kid, My first time when I had a Bible in my hand, and I read the Bible, and I wondered the whole time when I found out that it had been written in Greek. What does it really say? And those of you who have studied foreign languages know that translation is not easy to do. So what do the words mean? What do they say? Especially within the context, even cultural context, and that's the point. Ancient cultures and literature, we have to understand. So, what I wanted to do today is I wanted to go through, well, I'll start with the Greek words of the day. We always do the Greek words of the day. And these Greek words are, I chose them specific. And by the way, theos is wrong, so you can write your own Greek for theos. I don't know why I missed changing that word. I had another word in there before. But the reason I put these words up become very obvious. And this again gets back to the cultural context or historical context of Hebrews, which we're just beginning to touch. So this one, the O in Greek makes an H sound, H-O-D-O-U-S. That's a exact literal transliteration. But this word is hodos. And usually in the Gospels we see this as teen hodos. Now teen hodos we learned when we studied Mark. Mark is full of teen hodos references and full of teen hodos. Because teen hodos means the way. Now what is teen hodos? I use the Socratic method and I use interactive. So if you want to be interactive, you can. If you don't, that's okay too. Because I'll always answer the questions for you eventually, unless it's one of those. I try to get aha moments in. So I'd like you to have an aha moment at least once in a class. And I try to build to them. So if you have one, that's good. If you miss it, I'll try to help you out with that. But in any case, teen hodos is what the people that follow Jesus Christ call themselves. Now I'm skipping ahead, brothers, but you have to realize we have to know this. I'll eventually get to this. I think I gave you an outline, and you can see the outline. I've got this class. I've got the veracity of Hebrews. We will be doing Hebrews at the same time that we're looking at these different points. We'll really get into it in the third one where it says historical prelude world, historical prelude Levant. What I'll try to do is I'd like to intermesh or focus each of the classes on what's specifically in the introduction here. And I've done this in the other classes too. So that what we do is we don't go, I could teach whole class, and this class may go more than one semester, so I'm sorry about that. But I could teach a whole class just on the history of the events and the history of the work. But that's not what you want. That's not what I want either, right? I'd like to get into the document. So what I want to try to do is intermesh the two. That way we talk about the history, the culture, the literature, and at the same time we talk about the actual words of the document. And by the way, the document itself will give us all kinds of really neat functional information that will help us understand the times and the place. And so that's the way we kind of work this. So as we start, we say, okay, well this word, teen hodos, if you remember, who started calling Christians Christians?
The Greeks.
The Greeks at Antioch. And we know that from the Acts. Why did the Greeks begin to call teen hodos the Christians?
Because they thought they saw a Mysterion, and Christ was the leader, so they named it after him.
That's right. And if you don't remember this, we will get into this because these are things that we have to understand about the times. We'll ease into it and we'll get more and more into it, but that's correct. What happened is they called themselves the Way. Why do they call themselves the Way? Who probably called it the Way the first time? Jesus. Yeah, I bet he did. Because we see it. Now, we don't see, there is no place where Jesus specifically says, you are the way. But he says what?
I am the way.
I am the way. I am teen hodos. I am Teen Hodos. And by the way, if you remember way back we looked at Micah or Malachi. In Malachi, what does it say in Hebrew? Over and over again, Malachi. It talks about the prophecies of the way. Now that's in Hebrew, not in Greek. But the Septuagint calls it Teen Hodos. So the early, I almost hate using the word Christians, right? Because the Christians didn't want to be called Christians. And the reason is because Christians is a form of a name that's based on the Mysterion. The Mysterion is very important to us historically. Although, and as a matter, I talked to a young theological or a theological student about this. They're actually teaching this in some of the schools, in religious things, which I think is wonderful because it's going back to some of the truth. Unfortunately, I bet the way they teach it is a very negative fashion. Do you know what I'm saying? The Mysterion, well, I won't go into that, but the Mysterion is important is because Christianity or the way looks like a Mysterion. And the way the Greeks named Mysterions was after their leaders or their god. So therefore the Pythagorean Mysterion was named after Pythagoras. The Mithrin Mysterion was named after Mithras, their god. So what you did is you named them after your god or your leader. And so the Greeks at Antioch thought that Christianity or thought the way looked like a Mysterion, and they called it that. I've got some references that I keep in my notes all the time, because if you go back and look at Acts when Felix is questioning Paul, Paul is talking to Felix and to Herod, and he tells Herod, we call it the way, but you call it Christians. That group you call Christians is called the way. Very interesting. Because Herod was very Hellenized in Greek. But in any case, the reason it's important, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to another class, but we must always note that in this period we have the Pharisees, we have the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and Teen Hodos. Those are the 5 sects of Judaism at the time. Now, I think its Origen lists 7, but we can't find the other 2, and he doesn't name them. He says there are 7 sects of Judaism at the time. They may be break-off sects of the Pharisees and Sadducees, or he may be talking about something else. The thing he may be talking about is something else that we mention all the time, the schools of Judaism. Let's see, here's a kind of a picture of the Levant, SX, it's kind of ish, all right? So I have the Galilee, I have Jerusalem, I have Alexandria, and I have Babylon. And there are 4 schools of Judaism. In the time of Alexander, how many schools of Judaism were there? Which ones had gone bye-bye? Babylon may or may not, but Babylon's probably, defunct. Who else is defunct in Origen's period? Origen is later than, after 100 AD. Alexandria is still around. Galileo is still around. What happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD? Remember? Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, so the school of Jerusalem is gone. So if you were to take you have generally the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees are generally the ones who are in charge of the schools. So depending on how you look at it, you could have the general Pharisees. If you broke it out into 2 schools, if I still have a 3rd school like Babylon, then I definitely have 7, right? He never mentioned how many. The problem with this, and here we go, here's the cultural thing. What do people write down?
The unusual.
Yeah, they always write down the unusual, or if you have a stroke of genius, right, I hope you write it down. or an idea, right? You write down your strikes of genius, your inspirations, your ideas. What do you not write down?
The everyday mundane things.
Unless you're keeping a diary. I'm sorry.
Well, even with the diaries.
Or log.
Well, for example, people when they write their diaries, what do they write? Had breakfast. They don't write, okay, I went into the kitchen, I made coffee this way, I made my waffles this, right? I mean, that would, if you did that, you could not live a day, right? I mean, even if you did it verbally, right? I mean, you'd have problems. Maybe in the future, that would be terrible, listen to a diary like that. But in any case, that is precisely correct. You don't. And if you look, for example, look at what our, I didn't bring mine, but, you know, our Holy Cross, Life at Holy Cross, right? Could you reenact a whole service based on the Life at Holy Cross? No, you couldn't. There's too much going on that you have no idea. There's pieces, parts that come in. This is true of all historical documents. This is true of all of history. And so the fact that Origen does not mention the names of all 7, but he mentions there's 7, it's very interesting. And like I said, I know Jerusalem School is like, they've disbanded. They lost. And by the way, the New Testament, the big fight, okay, if you don't know this, those who are at Mark class know this, and those in the other class, Matthew class, know this. But what's the huge fight between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and everybody? What's the big fight?
Resurrection?
No, they're all Jerusalem school, and he's the school of the Galileo, or they assume he's the school of the Galileo, right? And so they always, all the questions they ask him, all those Pharisaical questions in the New Testament are all questions about the Jerusalem school versus the school of the Galileo. Because they want to know which school he's in, and what does he do? His answers are not from either school. That's the point. He basically goes, Kawang, you know, he's like the guy with a hammer and goes, and they ask him a stupid question, he's like, bang, you know, intellectually that is, and tells him, you're an idiot. You know, go back to the Torah, go back to the Talmud, go back to the Tanakh. And these are other, all right, again, we have other things. So, we'll talk about where the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos came from, if you don't know already, but that's, like I said, that's something we'll move into. Now, what was the point? There was an important point that we just transitioned to about the schools. No, maybe it'll come back to me. In any case, here is the other word. This is Christianous. Christianos. Christianos is Christians. This is the word used in Acts specifically. I don't believe we find this word in Hebrews, but we will look for it. We find the word Christus rarely too. We find mostly Jesus. Teen Hodos, I don't believe is in Hebrews, but we'll look for it. These are things we need to look for. The reason I'm giving to you is because, well, these are the names. This is the name. There is a church called The Way, by the way. Ah. Yeah. All right, how about this one? This is Charis. Now, to preempt, I should have given the other 3 words, but I'll give them to you anyway. We have Charis, we have Doxa, and we have Elpis. Anybody care to enlighten us about the 3 words Charis, Doxa, and Elpis? Why they're important?
Charis is grace, translated grace.
It's translated grace, and it's the favored word of the Greeks. Charis is the Greeks. The Greeks are really, now charis. What does charis mean? Charis, okay, we have translated it as grace. Grace. I'm not going to ask you to tell me what grace means because we'd be sitting here for like 3 days, right? Nobody really understands what grace means. But grace in Greek is like ciao in Italian. When do I say ciao?
Hello,
It's like
goodbye.
hello.
Hello and goodbye. It's literally, ciao is telling a person very similar to charis. Charis means literally graciousness or grace to you. And it is a greeting in Greek. We imagine, I think it's a terrible faulty imagining, that grace is one of these rare words, barely ever used by the Greeks. But grace is the word that is used when greeting people. So when the angel comes to Mary, he says, charis. When you greet a person in the street, you say, charis. When you say bye, you say, charis. It is not a rare word, and the word did not take on a magical, significant theological meaning because of Christianity. This is something else we need to flush out of our system. I do ancient Greek. Ancient Greek is usually considered the Greek, usually about 300 BC, and we can use BCE if you want. Okay, I don't care. BC, BCE. You know, before Christ, or BCE is before the Common Era. All right, I get it, the modern thing. From about 300, prior to 300 BCE, you have what's called Athenian or classical Greek. Okay, past greater than 300 BC, you have what's called Koinean. Common Greek. Now, I will argue, and Woodhouse will too. Woodhouse is my great support. Woodhouse is the translation of the Athenian classical Greek. That's the dictionary used. You can find it online. It's really good. Woodhouse's Greek. I use it in this class all the time. I just don't tell you guys about it, but I use it as a source document. The other two are Strong's and Vines. So if you, and this is probably kind of light. I want this is darker. So if you want to study Greek in the original tongue, you study Woodhouse. Ooh, that's good. Woodhouse. You study Vines and Strong's. Strong's and Vines are Koinean, and Woodhouse is classical. Now, when writing a document, even after 300 BCE, what do you think the most important thing to you as a writer in Greek is? What forms do you want to follow? In English, let's say, Jan's not here. I wish Jan were here. She would give me the backup in English. In English, when I write, let's say you're writing a technical document or you're writing something that's an important paper. Do you use slang? Do you use jingoism? Do you use words that are in common, the common speech that you use? What kind of words do you use? Proper, classical, right? So if I'm writing, even in this period, what kind of style do I want to apply? The highest that I know of, which is Athenian or classical Greek. So I argue that when Paul and other writers of the New Testament were writing their documents, their intention was to write in the highest level of Greek they could. There's a lot of reasons for that. If you're a scholar, I've written about 70 technical articles, so I think I'm kind of a scholar. So if you're a scholar, you want other scholars to read your writing, right? And if they can't understand it, or it's outside of the sphere of normal writing, or if it's slang or incorrect, how much authority does that writing have? I've been writing about the rhetorical arguments for someone that asked me in my blog page about rhetorical arguments in writing. And one of the great rhetorical arguments is ethos. And ethos is the appeal to authority. So if your writing is bad, what kind of appeal is that? Zero. I assure you that the writers of the New Testament documents were working to write the most classical, highest level of Greek they could. Therefore, their Greek is going to follow classical structures and classical language. They did not invent words, in other words. That is a problem with Strong's and Vine's. The problem with Strong's and Vine's and an idea that is incorrect in Koinean Greek. Number one, there are other documents written in Koinean Greek other than the New Testament. For a long time we didn't know this, but there are many. Many of those documents are called the, not the Dead Sea Scroll documents, but the, what's that other discovery area? No, not the Didache. It's not a specific document. It's where they found them. I can't remember it's a place where they found a lot of the scrolls. And a lot of Gnostic writings are found there. I wish I could remember offhand. But anyway, a lot of the Gnostic documents, there's documents from that period, many of them in Koinean Greek. The Greek itself is near classical, but the words have changed slightly. It's like in English, how words have changed. Finally, this word, oh, and I should mention this. Doxa is Roman. Doxa is glory. The Romans sought glory. And Elpis is uniquely, it's not Hebrew, it's Greek. It means peace. But the reason it's Hebrew is because the Hebrews' favorites. What did you say when you leave with a Hebrew?
Shalom.
Shalom. Shalom literally means still waters. The water's unmoving. But shalom in Greek, that's peace. Shalom. And so the Hebrews were interested in shalom, the Romans interested in doxa, and the Greeks interested in charis. That is grace, graciousness. Graciousness is a little better than grace. Graciousness is how I treat people in a Greek standpoint. So when we are looking for words in especially the New Testament documents, we look for these three words. They're code words, let's say, for who the speaker or the writer is speaking to. And finally, the reason I put this one up is because this is Theos. Theos is God. And God or God, or little God. The reason that I put this up is because this is literally the first word in Hebrew, Theos. Theos. Unfortunately, not in the translations, most translations, but it is in the Greek. So the first word in Hebrew is Theos, which is very interesting in my opinion. Now, let's talk about Hebrews a little bit as a document. And then what we'll do is we can, this is what we're going to add to. The first question that I think everybody is interested in, and I don't know if I put it in the class thing. I put it on my own notes, but we'll get there. So, who's the author of Hebrews?
We don't know.
Yeah. Nobody knows. We have no idea. Usually attributed to, well,
It could be.
yeah.
Older prophets will say that Paul wrote it.
Paul, right? The problem with that is just like, okay, all right, I don't want to burst your bubble too much. Remember we looked at LXX? When we did the Psalms, LXX is, remember what that is? That's Septuagint. Yeah, and the Septuagint is what we will use. As a matter of fact, what is Hebrews really well known for in connection with the Septuagint? And okay, so make sure everyone understands. Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament documents, actually of the Tanakh, which includes the apocryphal documents. And this was done about 275 BC. It was completed, we believe. That's about right, give or take. Give or take. That's just a circa number. But LXX, how is LXX and Hebrews connected? All right, I'm going to give you a little bit of an interesting information. I've told you this before. Every quote in the New Testament from the Old Testament, from the Tanakh, and I hate to say Old Testament, it's really the Tanakh, from the Jewish Old Testament documents, every quote comes directly from the Septuagint. However, Hebrews is considered unique by some scholars to be verbatim quotes. In other words, the quotes you have in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke and in Paul's documents, sometimes they leave out, in the end, or they change, they're a little bit different than the official Septuagint readings. Sometimes they're just a little bit off.
Paraphrased.
They appear to be, they're just from the memory, right? However, this guy who wrote Hebrews appeared to be either really good at memorization, which they were all supposed to be, right? We'll get into this too. This is a big deal for this thing. How are documents transmitted? How are they done? We'll talk about that. But the big deal is, whoever was writing Hebrews got it word for word perfect. Now, I think it's a little bit, it's good evidence, okay? I think the scholars may be looking a little bit too close, right? And I want to immediately mention something. When we talk about quotes, and we will get to them very quickly in Hebrews, when we talk about quotes, we talk about a thing called rabbinic context. In rabbinic context, this is an absolute truism. You can't miss this. Because one of the most important things in writing ancient documents is, how expensive was it to write a document? Very expensive. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead, but I'm going to tell you right now, the cost of a scroll, we know the cost of a scroll before the printing press was equivalent to a 40-acre farm in France. Most libraries had 7 scrolls maximum. So a scroll was worth a lot of money. We absolutely know this because we got historical records on it from the medieval period. So how much was a scroll in this period? I don't know. I do know that you could get good deals in the marketplace, according to Plato and Socrates, from Demosthenes talks about getting a good deal on a scroll. But when you got a scroll, I also have to mention this, when you got a scroll, you also got a slave who had memorized the scroll, who read the scroll. We'll get more into that later, so I won't go too much into that. But in any case, because it was so costly to write, when I mention a single part statement, and I should mention this too. There's so much in this. Remember, there are no punctuation, there's no sentences, and we'll get more into this, there's no vowels, there's no punctuation, there's no capitals, in ancient writing. It all runs together. And in ancient Hebrew, there are no vowels either. So, when I write a statement in a foreign language, especially in ancient language, I can't afford to quote everything I want to quote. But even beyond that, the way the world was and the way the world is, especially in rabbinic context, means that when I quote something from, let's say, a psalm or from a book of the Old Testament, what am I implying?
You have to read more of it. You have to go back and read more. Not just that little bit.
That's exactly right.
Context.
It's the context. That's why we call it rabbinic context. So when we get a quote like, "The Lord is my shepherd," what does that mean we should go look at? Yeah, the whole 23rd Psalm. Not maybe, and I don't do this, but maybe we should not look just at the 23rd, but the 22nd and the 24th too. Because when they mean rabbinic context, and I'll go back to what I was going to say, in LXX, did David write any of the Psalms? We don't know, because the Psalms were not attributed until LXX. The LXX scholars, the Greek translators, put on them all those little things that you see, a Psalm of David, a Psalm of Zechariah, or a Psalm of this, a Psalm of that. They added those.
Didn't Jesus say that David wrote at least one of the Psalms when he said, how did David say in the Spirit, my Lord, the Lord said to my Lord, etc. from the Psalm.
I don't disagree that some Psalms might be attributable to David. But my point is this. Just like older Bibles say Paul might have written Hebrews, or Paul was the writer of Hebrews, just like that we see in the LXX, there's an attribution that may or may not be correct. I mean, I don't want to argue the point. I'm not making I'm not trying to cause a fight. What I'm trying to point out is that the way we know, or we have got the attribution, and if we weigh them, we would say, well, I'll weigh that attribution, right? I mean, I'm not going to toss it out. It's historical evidence, see? But I'm going to know, as a Hebrew scholar, that when I look at LXX and compare the attribution of the Psalms, that they may or may not be correct. See? And the evidence that you gave is great. Yeah, David?
Couldn't that be part of the oral tradition that has since been lost?
Yes, and what I'm going to do, okay, because you said that, I've got to mention this. When we look at this, one of our primary documents is LXX Septuagint. So when I bring that up, we'll talk about Septuagint. But remember I told you, it is a translation in Greek of the Tanakh. Tanakh. The Tanakh is what we consider the Old Testament. The Old Testament is broken into 3 parts by the Hebrews, and I don't remember them exactly, but one of them is Torah, the Psalms, they have a word for it, Psalms, and there's another one, the prophets. They're Psalms, Torah, and the prophets. You just say that. But they don't break them the way we break them up. That's okay. That's just their thing. So I may get into that a little bit. I think I've had in some of my other notes. But the big deal is, it's not just the Tanakh. It's also the Talmud, the Talmud, and the Mishnah. Talmud and Mishnah. The Talmud is the written Mishnah. The written is the oral tradition that was given to Moses. Moses wrote the Torah, right? Actually, Moses didn't write the Torah. The Jewish people believe, the Hebrew people believe, that God literally gave Moses the Torah on the rocks, whatever, the whole thing, the whole Torah. I'll explain that later when we get another class. But supposedly wrote the whole thing. And God also gave Moses the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was not written down. It was the verbal part, the oral tradition that Moses passed on to the Pharisees and Sadducees. Unfortunately, the Sadducees did not believe the Mishnah, or did not see the authority of the Mishnah. The Pharisees did. This is one of the huge splits between Pharisees and Sadducees. The Pharisees wrote down the Talmud in both the Babylonian school and the Jerusalem school in about 100 AD. And you say, well, how could that be if they weren't around? Well, we believe that remnants of the Babylonian school were still hanging, and we believe that remnants of the Jerusalem school were still hanging. They were still around that period. But that is when they wrote them. They're 2 separate Talmuds. One is the Babylonian Talmud and one is the Jerusalem Talmud. And that's the written down Mishnah. And that was the oral traditions that were passed down. Now, it doesn't give us enough evidence for Septuagint. So that may have been another tradition. But remember, these are Hebrew dudes. Remember when I don't know if anyone's in the Psalms classes. Psalms are pretty complex things, aren't they? I mean, they're not just... It's Hebrew, for goodness sakes. Hebrew is euphemistic. We're going to talk about Greek, which is not euphemistic. But Hebrew is absolutely euphemistic. There are things you can pull out of the Hebrew documents that will blow your mind. Because one word, literally, elf. Elf, alpha, elf, can mean a, oxen, friend, one. I think there's a couple other meanings too. And it may mean all those things in the context of a single psalm. It'll drive you nuts. But that's the complexity of Hebrew. So, we don't know who wrote it, but the external evidence tells us, like for example, the first author to cite this epistle, I know you won't know this, I could ask, does anybody know? Clement. Clement quoted Hebrews. He's the first of the apostolic fathers, and he quoted it in 96 AD, circa 96 AD in his documents. We know he's writing in that period. We know he wrote and lived in that period. This means what? What does that tell us about Hebrews?
First written prior to 96 AD.
It exactly had to be written before 96 AD. So when, okay, remember Brown. I hate Brown. He's an idiot. Okay, the guy who wrote the, what's that thing you wrote? The Da Vinci Code. The guy is a moron, all right? Because the only way that Clement could quote Hebrews is if Hebrews already existed. And he says that the church fathers wrote all the documents when? He says in the 300s. He says when the Council of Nicaea got together, which is incorrect. Council of Nicaea did not write any documents other than Nicene Creed and a couple other things. The Council of Nicaea did not even give you a canon. The Council of Nicaea did very little. We can talk about what they did at some point. But in 96 AD, Clement was quoting Hebrews, which means a document had to have been written prior to 96 AD. This is huge, because that means that Brown is not just wrong, he's an idiot. You know, how, I mean, you got to be an idiot. It means his scholarship is where? And you know what? Every guy on the internet that I talk about matter of fact, I gave a class to a group of guys, you know, in historical veracity, and I was just going over how do you prove historical veracity. And I talked about New Testament documents. And the first thing they wanted to do was do what? Argue with me that the documents were written in a 300 AD period. I'm like, dude, you got to be an idiot. The stuff has to be written before then because 96 AD is when Clement quotes it. Well, not only that, Paul wrote the very first document to anyone in the New Testament. When did he write it? And how do we know? He wrote it in 50, he wrote 1 Thessalonians in 52 AD. Now, part of the problem is, when is the anyone know what the earliest codex, I'll talk about codexes next week, but codex, the earliest collection of Pauline writings we have, what that date is? The earliest collection is 200 AD. This is where people kind of get it wrong. The thing is that no originals from any document exist in the ancient world, period, dot, and I'll talk about this next week. This is huge for veracity. But I think this is where they get confused. They go to a class at university, and the university person tells them, well, the earliest documents we have are 200 AD. And what do they assume?
That's when they were written.
Bingo. It's like, dude, you know, come on. Yeah, Clement was, what's more miraculous? Clement quoting Hebrews that may have been written in 200 AD in 96, right? I mean, that's kind of miraculous. I mean, that would drive me on one side anyway. I'm just saying, there are a lot of instances when you have quotes. So, Clement quoted it. He does not say he wrote the book. It is omitted, and we'll talk about this next week, from the Marcion's canon and the Maturion's canon. So it is excluded from their canons. Now, both those canons included most of the Pauline letters, but did not include Hebrews. They proposed, there's a lot have proposed. For example, Clement has been proposed as one of the authors of Hebrews. But there's a problem with that. Well, there's problems with that, and we'll get into that too. Pauline authorship was explicitly denied by Origen. Origen said there's no way that Paul wrote this, period, dot.
When did Origen write again?
Origen was around the, he's around this period. He's a little bit later, about I'm going to say 150, circa 150 is Origen. But Origen, the thing about Origen is Origen specifically says that Paul did not write it. And that's pretty good because why? It's really close to the source, right? And also Origen, well, it's interesting. You notice I think that Clement of Alexandria may have written it. And there's reasons for that. We'll talk about that big time. Origen made a very famous quote. Whoever wrote the epistle, God only knows for sure. I think Origen is maybe a little bit, talking a little bit, I don't know, over the top. Tertullian's about this same period too, about 150 with Origen, very, what do you call it with Origen? Tertullian suggested Barnabas. Luther was the first to suggest Apollos. And matter of fact, it's interesting. It is found, and I think I mentioned this already. It is found in the Corpus Paulium in this collection of Pauline works from 200 AD. So it is found in those. But what is interesting again is, although the first canons, Origen proposed a canon, but it was in response to, what's his name? Maturian, I said his name before, anyway, the very first canon was proposed by a Gnostic. And so the Origen came out with a canon, and I'll talk about that next week, that was, that added other documents. And so it's interesting that Hebrews was in the Pauline letters, but not included in the earliest canons. Because that in itself is unusual. Paul, many, even though Origen said Paul couldn't do it, here's why they may think that it could be Paul. The epistle closes in a typical Pauline fashion. We'll look in the back, 1325. Timothy is mentioned in Hebrews. We'll see that. And he is associated with Paul. The structure of the epistle is similar to Paul's style in doctrine. It has a doctrinal part and a practical portion, and I kind of argue about that, but anyway, that's okay. There's strong hints of Paul's point of view, the wording of the letter, especially compared to Galatians, for example. However, the arguments against Paul, the letter's anonymous. What is always in Paul's letters?
Right at the beginning.
I, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, right? Send you this letter. So why would he not do that? The only problem is this could have been written, well, all of them were written as scrolls. And okay, here's a little bit of historical information, really cool. Where do you always put the address and the authorship of a scroll? Scrolls have two parts, verso and recto. The verso is the front, that's where all the stuff's written. The recto is the back. They put it on the back. So most scrolls, they put the author, they put the address on the back of the scroll, not on the front. It was unusual for Paul to express at the beginning, but Paul always ended his letters with, not necessarily my own hand, but this is a letter from Paul, right? He always did an ethos to his own authority. The style of the writing is dramatically better than that of Paul. Although, as you remember, and we'll talk about it next week, no one wrote their own letters. No one wrote their own letters in the ancient world. That's just not what you did. The logical development is much more tightly written, woven than Paul. That would be expected, right? Because it's a Greek document written better. It appeals to spiritual witnesses, where Paul never appealed to spiritual witnesses. He always appealed to physical witnesses, right?
Yeah.
500 men saw this. People saw this. People knew this. He never appealed to spiritual witnesses, which Hebrews does. It talks about Timothy's imprisonment. in 1323. And the problem with that is what? Paul croaked it at about 55 AD. So if Paul croaked it in 55 AD, Timothy's imprisonment would be way too late for that. So, it doesn't fit with the timeline. How about old Barnabas? Barnabas, Tertullian thought that Barnabas did it. He was a Levite and therefore would know about the Jewish sacrificial system. There might be a play on his word of consolation, the fact that he was called the son of consolation. That's 1322 in Acts 4:36. Barnabas was from Cyprus. He would have had a strong interaction with Alexandrian and Hellenistic thought. And that's what I want you to remember this. This is very important. In any case, no matter who the author is or what we look at in Hebrews, Hebrews is very strongly Hebrew, Alexandrian, and Greek. It ain't Cyprus, friends. If you were just to make a guess at where the author came from, where's the only place? Well, there's only one place you get Alexandrian from, right? But we'll talk about this later in other classes, but in Alexandria, they had a temple, and they were doing the sacrificial system even after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. That's against the law, right? The Torah law. They were doing it. They didn't care. They had their own temple structure set up. There's only one place where you can mix Hebrew, Alexandria, and Greek. Because who owned Egypt?
Greeks.
The Greeks. The Greeks owned Egypt from about 300 something BC. 323 BC, I think. Contacts with Alexandria. The Greek is so polished. Does Barnabas seem like a guy who's really polished Greek? Nah. Because, well, I mean, you remember Paul and Barnabas didn't get together, had little issues, right? Maybe it was scholarship issues. Maybe Barnabas was a better writer. No, I don't think so. He was converted shortly after Pentecost, could therefore have been impacted by Stephen's instruction. Stephen's instruction is kind of mentioned, we'll see it. Stephen's speech, for example. Barnabas was a mediator between Christians, Jews, and Paul in Acts. And maybe continued, I don't know. I think this is kind of Paul. Tertullian he wrote a paper on it. Okay. Barnabas accompanied Paul on his first missionary journey, but they split up. Remember? So, and we don't know why they split up, but plus Barnabas, there's a problem with Barnabas. Paul was called Paul because that's his Greek name, right? He was Saul when he was with the Hebrews. So you would expect Paul to know a lot of. Barnabas, though, is a Hebrew name. And it doesn't appear like he had a Greek nom de plume, which means that he may not have been that conversant in Greek. Okay, there are 6 arguments in behalf of Apollos. Apollos was a close acquaintance with Paul, thus accounting for the Pauline influences. In fact, he learned it. He is connected with Alexandria. He came from Alexandria, right? That's where Apollos came from. The knowledge of the scriptures. LXX. The name Apollos. Yeah, I'm Hebrew and my name's Apollos. Yeah, that's going to get you a long ways, right? I don't think they check your ID getting into the temple for that one. His eloquence. Do you remember what Paul said about Apollos? He did not know the baptism of Jesus, but he was bringing what? People to Christ. Whoa! Holy smoke! That, I don't know. And he was doing it with mostly Greeks, right? Because that's where Paul met Apollos. We'll get into that big time. He knew Timothy, right? Through Paul. But Timothy also was with Paul, and Apollos was with Paul. So he had contact with Timothy. And Apollos had a lot of influence in the churches. As a matter of fact, okay, pounding Paul. How much influence did Pauline theology have on the church? Especially the really early church. All right. Here's the question. Do we have lamb for our Eucharist? What would Paul tell you?
Should.
He would say you should have lamb, you should have a big glass of wine, and you should have lots of matzah, right? Pauline theology was that the Eucharist should be celebrated even if you couldn't sacrifice the lamb at the temple, especially after the temple was destroyed. Who won in the big Eucharistic battle? Who invented our liturgy?
Christos?
John Chrysostom. John Chrysostom in Antioch was the one who caused us to do our Eucharist. John Chrysostom's, we're lucky we don't do it at 6 hours long. The Orthodox do it in 3 hours. The Catholics do it in 2. The Anglicans do it in 2. We do it in 1, or maybe 1.5. I mean, we've cut it, right? But John Chrysostom's Mass, and John Chrysostom in Antioch was likely influenced by Apollos. Apollos and the head of the church in Jerusalem. Because the heads of the church in Jerusalem told them what? Like aliens, right? In Acts, they told them, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. And so therefore, that was basically the call, and may have been the split between Barnabas and Paul. Because Paul said it's okay. The Christian fathers in Jerusalem said don't do it. And likely, Apollos may have said don't do it. But that's one of the things we need to look at in Hebrews. Because Hebrews talks about the sacrificial system. And eventually we'll get there. But just remember, Hebrews is not what it seems. We're going to dig into it. I will say that Apollos may have been the writer, but through studying the document, we'll dig in and see if we find more evidence. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray that you look after us this week. Pray that you would continue to enlighten us in your spirit. In your name we pray.